We have all heard, and probably used in our conversations with colleagues or friends, the familiar bromide, perceptions equal truth. Nowhere is this more prevalent than in the public schools, where our every move is subject to criticism and second-guessing by students, parents and the community. According to Dr. Bernhardt on page 42 of the text, the definitions of perceptions and its synonyms provide almost enough information to understand why it is important to know the perceptions of our students, teachers, administrators, parents, and members of our communities. The word perception leads us to such words as observation and opinion, with definitions that include assessing the presence of a positive school culture and climate also has a strong research-based rationale. One of the most prominent advocates in the field of school improvement is Dr. Larry Lizotte and the companion, Effective Schools movement. Let's take a moment to visit the tenets of this school of thought as expressed by Dr. Lizotte.
Dr. Larry Lizotte is known as the preeminent spokesperson for effective schools research and implementation. He has written numerous books based on the 7 correlates of effective schools and is an internationally renowned education consultant and commentator. Please welcome Dr. Larry Lizotte.
The first thing I'd like to do is to give you a brief definition of an effective school. An effective school is a school that can, in outcome, performance, or results terms, in student outcomes, performances, or results terms, reflective of its Learning for All mission, meaning you better be prepared if that's not your mission to successfully teach every child, each child, all children, then this work would not be what you would want to lean on and look to. Learning for All, demonstrate the presence of equity in quality. Equity in quality. We don't talk about quality alone because sometimes that gets confused with just the high achievers. We've got to talk about not only how well all of the kids are doing, but look at the various subsets of kids that we're responsible for. So we talk about equity and quality. Now, in your situation, what you want to be concerned about more than the absolute definition per se is the question of school improvement, continuous improvement. So let's look at the concept and see what it looks like in the real world. The primary difference between this definition of improving schools and the effective school is simply that we're interested in change over time. We want to see that your school is doing better this year than last and next year rather than this. So we're looking at continuous improvement, and if we had our druthers, we always like to look at continuous improvement in reference to the school that we're in. So we're not necessarily looking at some normed process. We're saying we want each school to commit to continuous improvement, to look at their situation, look at their students, look where they need to do work, come up with plans of action and strategies, and go from there. When we go into one of these schools that has high overall levels of achievement and no gaps in the distribution of that achievement, and we start to try to understand how did they get that way, that's a concept that we want to look at. And if any of you are interested in reading, or maybe some of you have read the book by one of the Canadian authors that talks about outliers. Malcolm Gladwell has a book out called Outliers. In Outliers, we're interested in outliers on the high side. Those schools that are serving particularly difficult populations of kids who over the last 40 years have been able to raise the achievement of all of those kids in that school. And it's trying to understand what they have done and what they do that makes that difference, that becomes the knowledge base that we hope that some of your schools have already drawn on or will draw on going forward. What we find when we look at schools in that regard, and we find these high-performing schools that particularly serve disadvantaged kids, economically disadvantaged kids, and other racial and ethnic groups and so forth, what we try to find is what makes the difference, and when we come up with that, what we end up with is what has come to be known as the correlates of effective schools. Now let me tell you very briefly why the correlates of effective schools matter to you. If you're trying to produce better results, better performance in your kids, you can't look just at the performance you got yesterday to help inform what you ought to do tomorrow. What you have to do is look at the things that cause student learning, cause student achievement. And there are two sets of variables that schools need to be cognizant of, schools need to talk about, form collaborative work teams around. And the two sets of variables that we talk about are, number one, the organizational characteristics or correlates of effective schools, which are associated with our work, and I'll give you a short list in just a couple of minutes. And the other body of work that needs to be brought into the conversation are the correlates of effective schools that are based on the principles of human learning, based on the principles of human learning. It may sound ironic, but schools right now are not really organized around learning. They're more or less organized around teaching and hope that the learning follows. We've got to be much more intentional about focusing the work of the teachers, the classrooms, and the school around learning. To do that, then, what we need to differentiate is the distinction between what we'll call trailing indicators. Student learning and student performance are trailing indicators. They trail behind the learning, they trail behind these other variables. And so what we want to work on then is to get you as school people to organize some of your efforts at improvement around what we'll call the leading indicators of learning. The leading indicators, the things that cause learning to happen. A number of the points that Director Spence made in his remarks clearly are leading indicators. One that I want to reinforce. He talked about the power and influence of readiness, prerequisite knowledge. If you look at the students in your classrooms who are struggling, typically the kids who are struggling the most are the kids who have not mastered the prerequisites, are not ready for the new lesson. And the longer that goes on, the harder and harder it becomes for them to catch up. So that's what I mean by the distinction between leading indicators and trailing indicators. The following screen summarizes the 7 correlates of effective schools that we have found over and over again. These correlates of effective schools show up in elementary settings, show up in middle grade settings, show up in high schools, show up in the United States, show up in Canada, show up around the world. These are the defining attributes. It's around these 7 variables, 7 constructs that we want you to create the conversation for your own schools in terms of going forward. Let me go down through them and just give you a half a second on each one, but I want to remind you as we even begin to talk about them even briefly here this afternoon, that these correlates, there's a body of research around each one. You do not have to go out and invent answers to the question of what do we do? What do high expectations look like? There's a body of work that can be referenced and can inform the decisions and the discussions that you're having at your individual schools. Having said that, then, let's just look at them. The first one is a climate of high expectations for success. If you don't have a belief system, and that's why I think it's so critical to say believe. If you don't have that belief system going in, that the kids can learn and will learn and should learn, then it's very hard to mobilize the energy. So what we want to do is talk about high expectations for success. The second variable we talk about and find over and over again is the issue of strong instructional leadership. Now, one of the things that has evolved over the last 20 or 30 years is we used to focus primarily on the principal as the instructional leader of the school. And as important as the principal he or she is, and there's no doubt about that, we now realize that leadership is a much more of a dispersed concept. We talk about teacher leaders, we talk about leadership teams, we talk about collaborative planning groups and so on and so forth, all playing a role in leadership in setting the course for the school. And the third variable is we talk about clear and focused mission. Clear and focused mission. One of the things you probably have heard maybe or read in some of your journals or magazines, they said that one of the toughest jobs of a leader is to keep the main thing the main thing. That's the main thing. Keep the main thing the main thing. We've got to keep a focus. There's too much that we could do in the name of good education, but if we just do it as if we're popping corn, it's not going to come together the way it needs to for the kids. So we talk about this issue of clear and focused mission. One of the school districts I work with out in the Southwest, they operationalized their mission of Learning for All by making these 3 promises, for example, to the parents whose children attend that school system. They said, number 1, we promise you that when your children step into one of our schools, we promise you that they'll be safe. Second, we promise you that when they step into a classroom, they will be challenged. And third, we promise you that when they finish school with us, they will be ready to go on to college, ready to go on to the world of work. 3 promises, safe, challenged, and ready, captured what their sense of what their mission was in terms of the Learning for All mission. The 4th characteristic we talk about is opportunity to learn, student time on task. Opportunity to learn. If you were to disaggregate data, and we are required to do this in the United States between advantaged and disadvantaged kids, and that's the big gap in achievement is, as Director Spence said, it derives from or due to poverty. The poverty influence is tremendously important in schools. But when we look at the gaps that we have in the U.S. in terms of this, what we find is about 2/3 of the gap, 2/3 of the observed gap between advantaged and disadvantaged kids in the U.S. is first a gap in opportunity to learn. And it's not, you will never in Canada or the United States close the actual learning gaps until you first close the opportunity to learn gaps. And one of the opportunity to learn gaps has to do with this issue of readiness and prerequisite knowledge. And we have to be prepared to deal with that. So opportunity and time, huge variables, huge variables. The next characteristic, the 5th one, is the frequent monitoring of student progress. We say that in the effective schools, student progress is monitored frequently. And one of the questions that often gets asked is, how frequently should teachers monitor pupil progress? And the answer we give is always the same, and that is, how frequently are teachers prepared to adjust instruction? If a teacher can adjust instruction in his or her classroom every 10 minutes, monitor every 10 minutes. If a teacher can only adjust instruction once a week in that classroom, monitor once a week. But if that teacher don't ever intend to adjust what he or she is about to do based on what they're learning from the data, why bother monitoring at all? Why not just start in September and head for June and hope it all works out at the end of the year? Number 6, safe, orderly environment. In the effective schools, we find this orderly, purposeful, business-like atmosphere, which is on the one hand free from the threat of physical harm, but on the other hand is conducive to teaching and learning. Yeah, that's a tough balance to strike. You don't want rigid systems that lock down the freedom of children, and on the other hand, though, you have to have a certain measure of orderliness if this is all going to come together in the way that we want. And finally, the 7th correlate that we talk about is that there must be a positive home-school relationship between the parents whose children go to school and the educators in the school. And this is easier said than done. The good news is that we now have a larger body of research about how to go about creating positive, forceful partnerships between home and school such that our kids will do better.
Here's the best part. When it comes to assessing the perceptions of students, staff, and parents as they relate to school climate and culture, or safe and orderly environment as expressed by Dr. Lizotte, it is not necessary to start from scratch in order to design questionnaires. This work has already been done for you, and culture and climate surveys are readily available from a number of endorsed effective schools websites. Here's an example of a school climate survey designed for middle and high school students and staff. You can pause this video to look more closely at each subcorrelate. We have also posted this resource in the Canvas Files tab for you to access and review. You will notice that the survey is divided into 6 subgroups: safety and structure, belonging and group membership, self-worth and ability to contribute, independence and control, closeness and good relationships, and competence and mastery. We now want to demonstrate more fully what the collection of student perception data would look like and what it might tell us in a public high school setting. We conducted a mock survey in a make-believe high school of 940 students, where 45% of those students are enrolled in the free and reduced lunch price program. New York State considers these students as economically disadvantaged. In this make-believe situation, we administered one portion of the Effective Schools survey to these students, that being the 16 questions under the Student Safety and Structure heading. Your task is to discern the bias by looking at the accompanying graph. You will also be required during the class session on July 13th to discuss what we can learn from the graph results in terms of the students' perceptions of safety and structure in their school and the measures a building leader might employ to overcome the apparent negative student perceptions. The original Excel file is posted in the Canvas Files tab and in the Chapter 4 module. Assembling a survey that asks the right questions and derives the most informative answers is no easy feat. In Figure 4.1 of the text, Bernhard illustrates the various stages of the questionnaire process, beginning with determining the purpose, development of the instrument, collecting the data and reporting the results. As your assignment, we want you to develop and administer a simple questionnaire to a sample group of colleagues. Before you get started, we want you to view this short video. The presenter provides you with 7 tips for developing good survey questions.
When we're conducting a survey, we like to make sure we're asking questions that will collect accurate and useful information. But it isn't always obvious what makes a survey question a good survey question. Here are 7 tips that can help in developing good survey questions. 1. A good question is one where all respondents interpret the question in a consistent manner. That's not always easy to achieve. The question, "Have you ever been the victim of a serious crime?" might be interpreted differently by different people. Is getting your car stolen a serious crime? Probably. What about your bicycle? What about your skateboard? Make sure your questions are as clear and as specific as possible. 2. A good question is also one where people are willing to answer the question. If a survey asks about very personal things such as sexual behavior or drug use, you might find lots of people unwilling to answer such questions. If you need to ask personal questions, you need to craft those questions carefully and explain to the respondent why you need this information and assure them that you'll keep their responses confidential or even anonymous. 3. A good question is one that a respondent will answer truthfully. Let's take the following question as an example. Do you own a library card? Seems clear enough, and it doesn't seem too personal, but surprisingly, lots of respondents might say yes, even when they don't have a library card. Why is that? It's something called social desirability. Reading books, being well read, is socially desirable. So someone who never goes to the library might not want to admit that they don't have a library card for fear that they might be judged negatively. It might be better to ask the question this way. Some people get books from a library, others buy them from bookstores or online. Do you currently have a library card or not? That might sound a little awkward, but you're more likely to get a more truthful answer. 4. A good question is one that a respondent can actually answer. If you ask someone how much money they spend on groceries in an average month, you might be surprised how many people would say they weren't sure. Make sure people have the knowledge or information to answer your survey question. 5. Avoid double-barreled questions. These are questions that ask for a single answer to a question that really has 2 different parts. For example, let's say you are asked the following question. Do you believe the United States should spend more money on education and less money locking up non-violent criminals? That's a double-barreled question. Respondents who agree with one part but not the other will have trouble answering this question. You should break that question into 2 separate questions. 6. Avoid biased terms or wording. This is probably the hardest thing to do when writing questions. Should you use the term Obamacare or use the Affordable Care Act? Should you use the term welfare or should you say assistance to the poor? It isn't obvious which is the better terminology, but different terms will likely lead to different answers. Surveys will sometimes give one question to half the sample and a slightly different worded question to another half to see how respondents react to the different wording. 7. Pre-test your questions. This is the most important tip. You need to try out your questions on real people and then ask for feedback. Were they confused by a question? Did they answer in a way that surprised you? Pre-testing will help you find out if you have any problems with your questions. Of course, there is no such thing as a perfect survey question. Instead, our goal is to create questions that elicit meaningful responses. Surveys take time and money. We don't want to waste our time and the respondents' time asking bad questions. Following these 7 tips can help you craft clear and useful survey questions.
In addition to developing a sample questionnaire, you will also be required to administer the questionnaire using online tools such as SurveyMonkey or Google Forms. Both are easy to use and free of charge. There are numerous online tutorials available at youtube.com demonstrating how to use SurveyMonkey and Google Forms. Here's the assignment. You are to develop a questionnaire that seeks to discover what at least 5 test subjects think about the staff development opportunities that are offered by your school district. The survey should include at least 3 multiple-choice questions. It must be administered online to at least 5 colleagues. The results must be tallied and shared with the EDU 599 group during the regularly scheduled class time.